Israeli army is waging war against the AC unit at hospitals in Gaza. And the head of the ADL yesterday called for the FBI and IRS to investigate student organizations on campuses. It's basically, when you cannot win the argument, you have to shoot the messenger. So this situation, what's going on, everyone is aware. Like to have to welcome you to a good discussion. Each speaker will speak for 10 to 12 minutes. After they're done, we'll have Q&A. When you ask questions, please be short, right to the point. No insults. I have respect for everybody here. And the first panel will finish. We'll have a second panel starting 1:45. And I have to ask Bruce DelValle, the moderator, to introduce the speakers. And so each speaker will come to the microphone, give their 10, 12 minutes, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Bruce DelValle, and I am absolutely pleased and honored to be moderating this panel. One of the first things I want you to know is that as the moderator, I didn't come here to hear myself speak. And we share that. You didn't come here to hear me speak either. We have such an amazing panel here. It is an assemblage of some of the greatest journalists that the Middle East or on Middle East issues has to offer. And I think we can all agree that the role of journalism, while contentious, is well established as being important, but the role of journalism as it relates to this war is particularly focused and particularly problematic. And one of the questions that I want everyone to consider on the panel, the great Greek tragedy poet Aeschylus, who's one of my favorite poets, said, "In war, truth is the first casualty." And I think that has become a universal truth. And I would like to ask each of them to think about, and each of you to think about, how do you do your job? If truth is the first casualty of war, and I think it certainly has been historically, how do you go about searching for the truth? Are you finding the truth? Are you espousing the truth? Or are you disseminating the truth? And what is truth? Our first speaker is Laila Al-Arian. She is a Washington, D.C.-based journalist, and she's the executive producer of Fault Lines, which is an award-winning current events affairs program on Al Jazeera English. She's produced documentaries on subjects ranging from the Trump administration's Muslim ban to the impact of the heroin epidemic on children, and an investigation into factory conditions producing garments for Walmart and the Gap in Bangladesh. Al Jazeera is an important voice. Ms. Al-Arian is an important part of that voice. A question that I would like to ask her is the show Fault Lines, one of its subtitles is Examining America and Its Role in the World. We know that for some say that this is a precipitous leap by Biden. The Biden administration has leapt into this conflict and chosen a side, almost at the outset. So I would like to ask her to consider addressing what is the U.S. role in the Gaza war? What should it be, if anything? Laila Al-Arian, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here to listen to this very important discussion on the role of the media in Israel's current war on Gaza. Where do you even begin? I was told I have 10 to 12 minutes, but that is not anywhere near sufficient time to talk about what I believe is one of the most colossal media failures of our time. And that's saying a lot. It brings us back to the time leading up to the Iraq War, when US media organizations were complicit in spreading misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies and manipulations to help justify the unjust and illegal war in Iraq. This was a failure that led to major newspapers, including the Washington Post and the New York Times, to actually apologize to their readers years later about their role in justifying the war in Iraq. Many people I've spoken to over the last 40 days, and that's how long Israel has been bombing Gaza, have said that this period reminds them of the aftermath of September 11th and also of that period leading up to the Iraq War. Again, where do you begin with the media's failures on this story? Well, the failures begin with the fact that if you were to watch or listen or read the media coverage in the US and in Europe, you would think that all of the violence in this land between the river and the sea in Palestine and Israel actually began on October 7th. All of the coverage is framed as Israel is responding to the Hamas attack, when in fact we know that 2023 was one of the deadliest years for Palestinians in recent memory, that more than 200 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank that year alone, that Israel has continued its project of illegal settlement building, land theft, and detaining Palestinians by the thousands, oftentimes in administrative detention or with no charge, and that the situation itself has been described by human rights groups as apartheid. The ethnic cleansing has continued for the Palestinian people going back to 75 years, but that context is devoid of the coverage that we see. Now, when we look at the war in Gaza itself, we see that every day is an absolute horror. Every day, new horrors come. We watch social media and we see a stream of videos, horrific videos that we cannot unsee. But what we see on social media is not reflected in the mainstream media coverage. 1 in every 200 people in Gaza has been killed. The majority of the people killed are women and children. When you look at the number of children killed, more than we're approaching 5,000 now at least, and it's believed to be an undercount. That exceeds the number of children killed annually in conflict since 2019. The numbers are staggering, and the coverage does not capture the horrors happening in Gaza. Israel has attacked hospitals, schools, refugee camps, people fleeing that it told to flee on convoys to the south, churches, mosques, dozens of bakeries, water stations, fishing boats. They've prevented food assistance from coming into the Gaza Strip. They are using starvation as a weapon of war. They are not allowing water and fuel in. They've cut off communication. They even bombed people digging graves. They've even killed people trying to bury their loved ones. Now, when you look at the philosophy of my network, Al Jazeera, which is one of the few networks that has been on the ground in Gaza since day one, Al Jazeera's philosophy is that we are there when the missiles land, whereas with most Western media, they're there when the missiles take off. And I'll get to that later. But it's incredibly important that the journalists on the ground covering this story are protected. In fact, Israel has killed more than 35 journalists in Gaza at least. This has been the highest death toll of journalists since the Committee to Protect Journalists began keeping these numbers. And yet, there is silence among my peers in the media industry here in the US. If any other country was killing journalists in these numbers, in this way, I bet you they would be an outcry. Now it is mostly met with silence or callous indifference. In terms of the coverage itself, we've seen since day one a reliance on unverified and a regurgitation and a stenography of unverified sensationalist allegations being reported as facts that help shape the narrative. We heard in the early days of Israel's attacks on Gaza about 40 beheaded babies that Hamas allegedly killed. In fact, we heard this lie regurgitated by our own president, Joe Biden, as well as the press secretary of the National Security Council. The White House later had to walk back that claim, and the Israeli military later admitted there was no evidence to that. And when you now look at the actual casualty numbers from October 7th, there is one 10-month-old child, I believe, who was a casualty. We also hear the media reporting on mass rapes, again, with no evidence. Just this week, they reported on a calendar that Israel claimed was a list of Hamas fighters, when in fact it was the days of the week in Arabic. And you saw, in terms of Israel's propaganda efforts, an Israeli actress pretending to be a nurse in Al-Shifa hospital, claiming that Hamas was using the hospital. So much of this information is reported as facts. The Israeli narrative is not questioned. Israeli military and government officials are given endless time on TV to spout their propaganda and shape the narrative. In fact, the IDF might as well be on CNN's payroll given the amount of time they've been given on CNN's airwaves. We also see a kind of circular logic that we also saw in the lead up to the Iraq War. So for instance, we saw a journalist ask a State Department spokesperson, what evidence do you have that Hamas is using Al-Shifa hospital as a command and control center? The State Department spokesperson says, refused to give any evidence and said, well, you can read about it in the press. When you actually look at the press reports, it's based on unnamed US and Israeli officials. So again, this kind of circular reasoning is what led to the misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies that helped pave the way for the war in Iraq. US media organizations also adapt Israeli language and framing. So we saw at the beginning of Israel's military campaign, the media report on Palestinian casualties, and they called it the Palestinian Ministry of Health. Once Israel started pressing them to call it the Hamas-run Ministry of Health, you saw the media adapt that and go ahead with it. And of course, what does it even mean when you call it Hamas-run, other than trying to use sensationalist language and to try to cast doubt on the numbers? Of course, we saw President Biden himself attempt to cast doubt on the numbers, only to be corrected by his own officials, including State Department officials who testified in Congress that in fact it's probably an undercount, especially given how many people still remain under the rubble. We also see since October 7th wall-to-wall coverage of Israeli deaths, including continuous interviews with victims and their families, while almost none for the far more numerous victims in Gaza. And even as Gaza witnesses horror after horror on a daily basis, from Israel shooting at people, leaving the hospital in terror and waving white flags, to killing hundreds in their homes at the Jabalia refugee camp, to reports of snipers purposefully targeting children in the ICU of a hospital, the wall-to-wall coverage of Israel continues unabated. The only message being sent here is that Palestinian lives simply don't matter. We saw a similar situation with the coverage of the pro-Palestinian rally on November 4th compared to yesterday's pro-Israel rally in DC, which was covered widely. And we see chants in yesterday's rally like no ceasefire, signs that say let Israel finish the job. Those are not covered in wall-to-wall media coverage like the way that journalists were wringing their hands over the slogan from the river to the sea, which inspired countless articles. You also see a reliance on Israeli army talking points, even when it's clear that Israelis have more incentive than ever not to be truthful, and in fact have a clear and documented history of lying and misleading the press. In 2021, during Israel's war in Gaza, the IDF told journalists they were going to do a ground incursion. That was reported. The IDF later came back and said, actually, we planted that story deliberately because we wanted the Hamas fighters to go underground so we can bomb them. So you have Israel openly admitting to using the press for its own military goals. We also, of course, saw Israel lie repeatedly about the circumstances of the killing of Al Jazeera veteran journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. And it was only after one investigation after another by multiple mainstream media, news organizations, and human rights organizations that they were finally forced to admit that one of their soldiers likely shot Shireen. You also saw just last week, less than a week ago, on November 10th, the Israeli military claimed that in the bombing of one of the hospitals, I believe is Al-Shifa, that killed numerous people, that it was a misfired projectile from Palestinian fighters. Yesterday, the New York Times released an open source investigation debunking that, saying it was Israeli munitions or shelling that caused that attack, but it's too late. When the media uncritically regurgitates the Israeli talking points, the Israeli narrative, that narrative sticks. And even if days, weeks, or months later that it comes out that they're not telling the truth, it's too late. That narrative has stuck. And finally, we saw that when Israel said it targeted terrorists in Lebanon, and it was in fact a mother, a grandmother, and 3 little girls, only the mother survived again. When they uncritically and unthinkingly regurgitate these talking points, without even questioning them or asking for evidence, that only serves Israel's propaganda purposes. This is also constantly being framed in the media as a war against Hamas, even as Israeli officials openly talk about punishing the population, punishing civilians. We saw this with Benjamin Netanyahu referring to the children of Gaza as children of darkness and the people of Gaza as Amalek. We saw this recently with the Avi Dichter, the Israeli Minister of Agriculture, saying we're now rolling out the Gaza Nakba, but none of these statements make it onto rolling news the way that other statements do. I think I've exceeded my time, but I did warn you at the beginning that there's no way to sum up the media failures that we're seeing day in and day out in just 10 to 12 minutes. Finally, I wanted to say that another theme that we see here is the fact that from day one, Israel has not allowed journalists into Gaza. So those who have been able to cover are the journalists in Gaza, trying to do this while also protecting their own lives, while also fleeing. And there has not been a conversation around the fact that Israel is violating the basic laws and rules of journalism by sealing the border and not allowing independent journalism to happen there. Of course, not international journalism. Of course, the journalists in Gaza are doing an incredible, courageous, and important job. And finally, you see, obviously, journalists embedding with the IDF, which only, again, serves Israel's propaganda purposes, and, in my opinion, is not real journalism. And as we know, these news organizations actually agreed to allow the IDF to sign on to their stories before they even broadcast or go to print as a condition of embedding. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Laila. And I would like to remind, Shireen was a colleague of Laila's. They were both employed by Al Jazeera. And seemingly we've all forgotten that Shireen was also an American citizen. She was a citizen of this country. And she was a journalist that was killed by the Israeli Defense Forces. We need to somehow figure a way to keep her memory alive, and I think it dovetails into these discussions that we're having today, the continued wrongs that don't seem to be any effort to be made right. Our next, oh, and by the way, if you have any questions at the end of this panel, we will address the questions, so if you want to write them down, that would be great, or if you don't want to write them down, yes, there will be a microphone, but just write down the questions, because I know some of you, I just see that hopefully you're being inspired by these presentations. Our next guest is Ryan Grimm. He is the Pulitzer Prize-winning bureau chief for The Intercept's D.C. office. He's the host of a podcast, Deconstructed. If you ever get a chance to listen to it, it's amazing. He authors the newsletter Bad News and was previously the Washington bureau chief for the Huffington Post, where he led a team that was twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and he has won once. And Mr. Grimm is here to speak to you about the issues we're here for today, which is the media coverage and editorial accountability. I was somewhat remiss when I didn't introduce the topic. And today's headline in The Intercept is The Gaza Siege, a harsh spotlight on the West's moral bankruptcy. As we have said, truth is the first casualty. What is the role of the United States in the Gaza war? What is the role of the United States press in the Gaza war? And to address those and other comments, here's Mr. Ryan Grimm. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. One correction, the Pulitzer was a member of my team at the D.C. Bureau. I did not personally win it. I was involved, but I appreciate that.
I'm used to assigning
there you go.
credit to things that don't deserve it.
There you go. So I don't want to take up much time because I want to leave plenty for questions and for other panelists here. But I did just want to say it almost feels off for me to be invited here because I don't feel like an expert on this question. I feel like all I'm doing is doing objective journalism when it comes to this issue. But I feel like the actual journalism that is done in the United States around Israel, Palestine, and particularly in Gaza, is so radically slanted over to the pro-Israel side that covering the situation objectively kind of appears to people to be radical, appears to people to be siding with one side or the other. To use active language rather than passive language feels to people like you're putting a thumb on the scale. There was a tremendous innovation in passive phrasing that was introduced into the lexicon yesterday, if you guys noticed it, by Van Jones during his speech. I don't remember the exact phrasing, but it said something like, he hoped that the bombs would stop falling from the sky onto Palestinians. And it just stopped me in my tracks. I would hope that too. Like, where are these bombs falling from? What kind of clouds are kind of gathering over Gaza that are just allowing these bombs to fall out of them? And still, that phrasing drew, as I'm sure you've seen the footage from the rally after that, drew chants of no ceasefire. And then you see him respond. Like, you could tell that he tried to say it in the least objectionable possible way and still met with kind of vociferous objection from them. One of the things I wanted to just highlight, maybe we can talk about this more, was the way that the coverage of the initial strike at the hospital seems to have shaped everything since then. You had what may have, and we can talk about this more later, it may have been something of a mistranslation in the Western press about 500 killed rather than 500 killed and wounded, because the wounded in the Western press don't matter. Like, the only thing that gets counted in the Western press are people who have died. People who were injured, people who slept out in the cold and the rain last night, people who were displaced from their homes. Those don't count. The dead don't necessarily count, but at least they're listed. And so it seems like the Western press quickly collapsed killed and wounded into just killed, and then kind of fact-checked its own false claim and said, well, now you can't trust anything. And reporting on it, it makes you crazy because the IDF had already, at that point, justified why it had attacked the hospital, then went on to say that it had not attacked the hospital, then went on to attack essentially every other hospital in Gaza. And so, as a reporter, you're just left bewildered and stammering. Well, which is it? It was you, and it was justified. It wasn't you. That one was you, but this one wasn't you. And so many reporters just wind up just quoting the IDF and just moving on because they're just so bewildered at all of this coming at them. Just wanted to, and to this point, I just wanted to read a couple of, Laila mentioned a couple of them. Just want to mention a couple of the other things that when you just quote them objectively, you seem like a crazy person. But when actually you're just quoting crazy things. And most of you have probably heard these. Here's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. We will eliminate everything. They will regret it. We will eliminate everything. You often then hear on CNN and other places, well, the difference between Hamas and Israel is that the Israelis try not to kill civilians. But unfortunately, they're killing them in record numbers, but they are trying not to do that. If that were true, you would still have to pair it as a journalist with, we will eliminate everything. A quote from the defense minister, or an IDF spokesperson quote, our focus is on damage, not on precision. Or Moshe Feiglin, who you all know is a very prominent former Likud Knesset member, there is one and only solution, which is to completely destroy Gaza before invading it. I mean destruction like what happened in Dresden and Hiroshima without nuclear weapons. Of course, Heritage Minister Amahai Elihu said that nuclear weapons ought to be one of the possibilities, unquote. Laila mentioned Agriculture Minister Avi Dichter's We are now rolling out the Gaza Nakba. And he was pressed on this then by the interviewer. Did you say Gaza Nakba? And he responded, yes, Gaza Nakba 2023. That's how it'll end. Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, we need, quote, sterile zones in the West Bank. This is the West Bank. This is not the Hamas-run West Bank. This is the West Bank. And of course, Israeli President Isaac Herzog, among many quotes, he said, it's an entire nation out there that is responsible. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against that evil regime. And so that's in the justification of the slaughter that then they also are denying. That's how I wanted to frame kind of the way that I think about my coverage here, and then hope we have a lot of time left for this.
Our next speaker is Miko Peled, and Miko is a writer and human rights activist that was born and raised in Jerusalem. Driven by a personal family tragedy, he was driven to explore Palestine, its people, and their narrative. He has written a book about his experience called The General Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. In addition to having work published in the LA Times, he is a contributor to Mondoweiss and the Mint Press News. He authors a blog, MikoPeled.com, and a podcast at patreon.com/Miko Peled. And one of the questions that I would like to kind of kick off the comments about is, are the events of October 6th and 7th best seen as a failure of the supposed invincibility of the Israeli army? Or is there more at play here? Looking at Palestine as a sovereign nation without a state, why would Hamas do what it did?
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for hosting this important event. Thank you for the question. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't begin by dedicating at least this event to the memory of Shirin Abu Akleh, who I believe was assassinated by Israel. It was not a fluke. It was not just some soldier who decided to shoot her. And to the memory, and to remembering, not the memory, but to remembering the courage of Julian Assange and other great journalists who are trying with everything they've got to present us with the truth. I think that in regards to the question, I think that the Israeli military has been proven already many times to be nothing more than a paper tiger. And the Palestinian fighters who came out of Gaza has shown that once again, that when they are challenged, they are at a loss. When the Israeli military is challenged, they're at a loss. And I don't think it was a coincidence that the attacks of October 7th took place precisely 50 years and 1 day after the assault or the 1973 war, which once again, the Israeli army proved itself to be nothing more than a paper tiger. I want to challenge the notion that there's a war going on. I want to challenge this narrative that says that there's a war between Israel and Hamas, there's a war between Israel and Gaza, there's a war going on against Gaza, and to take a broader look at what is actually taking place in Palestine. For the last 75 years, there's been an attempted genocide, there's been a campaign of ethnic cleansing, and there has been a regime of apartheid imposed upon Palestine. That is the story. But of course, sadly, we don't see that story in the news. The focus is on the one tiny little dot, one small thing, not small in terms of casualties, but historically one instance. And then the focus, of course, is on the fact that it's Hamas or it's not Hamas. The larger story has to be told for us to see the larger context. I think it was Hillary Clinton who said, well, you know, there was a ceasefire until October 7th, and suddenly the Palestinians decided to come out and commit these horrible acts of terrorism. Well, that is not the story. That is not what took place. Palestinians have been living a life of terror for 75 years, whether they live in the Gaza Strip, whether they live in what used to be known as the West Bank, which is really an area that no longer exists, and whether or not, or whether they live as citizens of the state of Israel in 1948 Palestine, or whether they live in refugee camps outside of Palestine. A constant life of terrorism, of being subjected to terrorism daily, day in and day out, arrested, detained, tortured, bombed, and no consequences for the side that is committing these terrible crimes. And by the way, the crime of apartheid, the crime of ethnic cleansing, and the crime of genocide are 3 crimes against humanity, and these are being perpetrated by the state of Israel, and there's no discussion about that. And that is a problem. That is a serious problem. Now, one of the reasons for this happens to be, I believe, that there has never been a real concerted effort to present the Palestinian story in a well-organized manner. There is no Palestinian presence in Washington, D.C. So how can we possibly look to American politicians, the press, the public, to present somewhat of an equal, some kind of a fair presentation of the reality? One side presents a very compelling, very thorough, very well-tested and well-produced narrative, and the other side is barely existing. And I think that is certainly one of the problems and one of the reasons we're seeing what we're seeing right now. Now, what happened on October the 7th? Palestinian fighters came out of the Gaza Strip, practically took over half of historic Palestine. The entire southern part of the country was taken by Palestinians. Over 22 Israeli settlements, towns, villages, kibbutzim were taken by the Palestinian fighters. The Israeli military was nowhere to be seen. The very sense of security that Israelis always thought they had failed, was not there. It took days upon days upon days before there was a sense of some kind of action by the Israeli army, by the Israeli government. They talk about hundreds of Israelis who were being killed, or maybe over 1,000 Israelis that were killed by the Palestinian fighters. And as the days and the weeks go by, we see more and more evidence, more and more witnesses coming out, saying that actually many of the Israelis were killed by Israeli fire. There was an Israeli witness, that saw the shelling of a house full of hostages by Israeli tanks. So we don't know how many were killed by the Palestinians. We don't know if any were killed by the Palestinians. Where is that story? That should be front and center. Then what we've seen, as the days progressed, as the week progressed, a massive, savage campaign of revenge. That's what we're seeing in Gaza. We're not seeing a war. There's not a war in Gaza. There's a massive, savage assault of revenge. The Israeli government, the Israeli military have been injured. They've been insulted. They've been humiliated by a small group of fighters who came out of one of the poorest and most oppressed places on earth. And they managed to paralyze the entire state of Israel. For weeks, Israelis are still afraid to leave their homes. I'm talking about Israeli Jews. I'm not even talking about the Palestinians. Israelis feeling uncertain. And they get some sense of satisfaction as they see the body count grow and grow and grow, the count of Palestinian civilians being killed. A war against Hamas? What does that even mean? Eradicate Hamas? What does that even mean? Nobody. I don't believe that anybody thinks that these are serious arguments, that there's any kind of a strategy here moving forward. It is revenge and destruction for the sake of destruction. And the conversation needs to be, and again, this is a serious, I believe, a serious lack here of looking forward. Everywhere we go, the protests, the conversations with people who actually care about what is happening to Palestinians is about ceasefire. Ceasefire, that's it. We've grown accustomed to demand so little for Palestinians, and Palestinians have been accustomed to expect so little, that ceasefire is it. What is ceasefire going to do? A few days of reprieve, a few days of humanitarian aid, and then Israel will violate the ceasefire like it always does. And then what? October the 7th should mark, and I believe does mark, a historical intersection. Palestinians have proven that they have the ability to paralyze the state of Israel. Palestinians deserve nothing less than a complete lifting of the siege on Gaza, billions of dollars in aid to rebuild Gaza, an absolute unconditional release of thousands and thousands of Palestinian prisoners. You want to talk about hostages? What does it mean when Israel takes a Palestinian and arrests them under administrative detention? How is that not a kidnapping? But somehow that is deemed legitimate because the Israeli terror operation, the Israeli IDF, which I've said before and has been quoted since, a military organization that is nothing more than a glorified terrorist organization. Well-armed, well-trained, well-fed, but nothing more than a terrorist organization. But because they have uniforms and generals and fighter jets, they are somehow seem legitimate. And they've been engaged in a war against the people who have never had an army, have never had a tank, have never had a warplane. And to think that in this city, there's anyone who dares to associate themselves with Israel, who dares to associate themselves with Zionism, and then there's this claim, well, there should be zero tolerance to racism. If there's zero tolerance to racism, why is it that the President of the United States is associating himself with Zionism and with Israel? How is it that this rally was allowed to take place, a rally that is calling for genocide, that represents genocide? Because the two sides here are not, you're either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. No. You're either fighting or you're supporting the fight against peace, you're supporting the fight against liberty, we're supporting the fight against justice, or we're supporting a fight for justice, or we're supporting the fight for liberty, or we're supporting the fight to finally give Israelis and Palestinians the possibility of living together in peace, because that is what it means when we support the Palestinian cause. The Palestinian cause calls for a better future, or a future, for Israelis and Palestinians. A free, democratic Palestine, from the river to the sea, presents the possibility of freedom and justice and peace for Israelis and Palestinians. The call to support Israel is a call to support genocide. And this didn't just happen on October the 7th. It didn't just happen now with this savage assault against Palestinians in Gaza. And by the way, the assault is not only in Gaza. The assault is against Palestinians in the West Bank. The assault is against Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. The Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Palestinians of 1948, are living in a state of terror. Never mind the hundreds and hundreds that are being killed and detained and so forth by the Israeli authorities. That is the story that we don't see. That is the story that should be, these should be the headlines. How is it possible that a member of Congress has to fear for her life? Has to fear for her life. I was at an event with Rashida Tlaib last night. Thousands and thousands of death threats. And does she get a detail, a Secret Service detail? No, she has to hire some security firm. If it was the other way around, they'd have the Marines protecting the other person. If this was a Jewish member of Congress, a Zionist member of Congress that felt threatened, they'd have the Marines there. They'd have the Navy SEALs protecting them. But no, Rashida Tlaib has to hire a private security firm so that she's not assassinated, so that her family is safe. These are the stories that need to be told. These are the stories that are sorely missing from the city, not only from the city, but actually, anywhere. I've done I don't know how many interviews, and again, that's my perspective of the media as somebody who's being interviewed. Almost every interview begins with the first 5-6 minutes arguing with the moderator about the basic precepts of what happened. There was no terror attack. It is not a terror attack when you stand up and resist oppression, when you stand up and resist attempts at genocide, when you stand up and resist a regime of apartheid, which, by the way, over a year ago, Amnesty International presented us with a report that shows very clearly that what is happening in Palestine is an apartheid state, an apartheid regime that was established when the State of Israel was established. Where is that headline? The demand for ceasefire is important. There's no question about that. But the fact that those of the people of conscience are now begging Israel, And when Israel finally agrees to a ceasefire, it is going to seem magnanimous. No, nothing less than the absolute guarantee of the safety and security of every Palestinian, man, woman, and child, should be accepted. Israel lost this round. And that needs to be translated into real political gain, a final political solution to the question of Palestine, a free Palestine, a liberated Palestine. The demand for justice, the demand for liberty, and the possibility of peace between Israelis and Palestinians that will guarantee the safety and security of Palestinians first, because they're the ones who are being killed, and of course, of Israelis as well. Nothing less of that should be presented. And again, as journalists, as the press, that needs to be the story. And that, once again, I have to agree with the other panelists, here. There's been a colossal failure to present what is actually taking place in Palestine for the last 75 years and since October the 7th. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to remind everyone that there is food and drinks, and it's free. So if you could please avail yourself of it, that would be great. We will not have to take it home or throw it away or whatever it is we're going to do with it. So if you guys want to get up and get some food, that would be great. We would appreciate that. Our next guest is Hafez Al Mirazi. He's a columnist, an independent broadcaster, and a professor of practice in television journalism. He's currently a columnist at Al Manasa, an Egyptian news website, writer and media critic, and host of YouTube shows, including his current series on Gaza from Washington. What is the current, I would like to ask you to consider, what is the current support for Israel in the war, in the Gaza events that are unfolding? I agree with Miko. I'm not sure it's fair to call it a war. If there's no army on the other side, if you will. There's no, I mean, certainly there are combatants, but perhaps defensive. This morning, Reuters had a headline that indicated in a story that said U.S. public support for Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza is waning, and there's calls for a ceasefire are growing. So the public support in the United States has declined precipitously by almost 20 or 30% within the last week. So I would like for you to consider addressing, perhaps, along with your comments, what is the current support for Israel in the backdrop of this constant drumbeat of the press that is absolutely, almost exclusively pro-Israel? And by the way, please do eat. Please don't make me be the Jewish grandmother and encourage you all to eat, but just eat, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I would like first to, as we are remembering our colleague Shireen Abu Akleh, I also think that we should also remember, as was mentioned before, that not only the people or the dead, but those who are still alive, most of the time they are shattered, broken, and even worse. If we give the example of Al Jazeera current senior correspondent in Gaza, Wael Al-Dahdouh. Wael, while covering the events around 2 weeks after the start of the war, he heard the bombing of a neighborhood close to where he was reporting live for Al Jazeera. After he finished, he found out that house was his house, and the death in that house were his wife, his 16-year-old son, his 6-year-old and youngest daughter, Sham, as well as his grandbaby son. So those people, while Dahdouh is still alive, while Dahdouh is still covering what he is doing for Al Jazeera and for the rest of the world, and he is not counted dead. Yes, 4 of his family are counted dead, but you could consider that when we talk about the number of deaths, and we consider it's only around 11,000, although only is something really shouldn't be acceptable, but it seems that the exchange rate for casualties that for the Israelis should not be less than 1 for 10 or maybe 1 for 100. People remember that the last prisoner exchange with Israelis was for Gilad Shalit, was about 1,400 for one soldier and 1,400 prisoners on Israeli, Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons. And that was the ratio, unfortunately. So let's hope that 1 for 10 should be enough, although the comparison even between around or close to 385 or close to 400 military who were killed have on the other side about 6,000 now children killed, children and women. I would like to start by the question you asked me, Bruce, about the support for Israel. I actually was trying to focus on the Arab media coverage of the war, as the rest of the panelists would talk about the American and the Western media coverage of the war. However, if we are talking about the support for Israel, which would be strange if we talk about how about in the Arab world, if there is support for Israel. And I would say, yes, there is still some tacit support, but it is not directly by politicians. But you would sense some of that, some kind of excuses and justification from political commentators and some columnists in some Arab Gulf media who are blaming the Palestinians for what happened, who are blaming Hamas for what you should have expected, that the Israelis always kill civilians, kill children. So it is not just you're blaming Israelis. How come when you retaliate, you retaliate with military, guerrillas, whatever you name it, but not to retaliate against civilians or children? But the assumption that is already accepted for some political commentators in some quarters of the Arab media, unfortunately, due to their influence of their government and control of the media, and also some of these governments consider that they were disappointed by someone spoiled their normalization big party that is being cooked. And that's for some reason, you would find that. But in general, I believe the support for Israel, although is still there in the U.S., if I would permit myself to assess what's going on, the media started to reconsider some of what they are doing. But unfortunately, last time I heard the NPR, it was like a week ago in my car, I found something that's totally against what we are teaching our students or even teaching kids, that in a news item you start with the latest and then you go for the background. So today, 200 people killed in Gaza, and then if you would like to go for the background, they say Hamas killed 1,200 or 1,400 Israelis on October 7. But in NPR, to hear that the news item is that on October 7, the background, 1,400 Israelis were killed, blah, blah, blah. And then in the retaliatory strikes by Israel, that number has been claimed by Hamas-run health department in Gaza. So if that is coming from NPR, you could imagine anything else, even from CNN. I'm not going to mention Fox. 20 years ago, I was in this city with Al Jazeera at that time, and in the same tough shoes that my colleague Abdurrahim Fuqra is in now as the bureau chief of Al Jazeera. And it was very tough. I mean, I remember Washington Post did an interview, a profile interview with me, and the line was, in the line of fire, and that those people are getting it from both sides. We are covering Washington for the Arab audience during the Iraq war, and we're supposed to be perceived as the sending end of the conflict, and for that reason we are promoting the propaganda of the Americans because we are covering Washington, while our colleagues who are at the receiving end in Iraq are being killed or imprisoned or so on. So, but at that time, at least, America was really at war, regardless if the war was justified or not. But when you see on CNN that Israel at war and all of CNN team are over there, you just wonder, I mean, is that supposed to be an American US news outlet or TV station or not? And then you would find the rest in the coverage of talking about, it's called Israel-Hamas war. And when you look for the casualties of Hamas, nobody ever, I haven't heard anyone telling me what is the casualties of Hamas if the war is Israel-Hamas war. One of the most important thing, as Miko was mentioning, I mean, fortunately, I did interview Miko in my podcast on Gaza from Washington, and I did not ask him to condemn Israel or condemn Hamas or condemn the Hamas as the way now every interviewer, as if it's in the book, that you have to start with, if we would like us to proceed and to hear from you, are you condemning Hamas? And I have taught for 11 years or more at the American University in Cairo, television journalism and the interviewing skills, never asked one of the students or anyone to start by asking that. And even those people who wanted to be tough and grill their interviewee, as in the case of my colleague, Rasha Nabil and Al-Arabiya, Saudi Al-Arabiya, she interviewed Khalid Mash'al, the former political leader of Hamas or head of Politburo, and she was very tough with him. She was hated in the whole Arab world and called even the Zionist, but yet, instead of people appreciating and look in the American media how an Arab journalist, regardless of the war and all of that stuff, she took the tough side and she grilled the interviewer who is the head of Islamic resistance movement. No, it's just using some clips from her in most of the talk shows and asking people why you did not, how Hamas failed their people. And this is a proof that they failed their people. And that's very, very sad, unfortunately. Just to give an example of the Bush administration that we are criticizing, in 2008, Condi Rice insisted that the Rafah crossing from Egypt being opened, and we did not have this kind of a relationship that we almost don't see any difference between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government. We have never seen this kind of being that close between each other. If I talk about the whole thing, the main thing of how do you evaluate the Arab media coverage of the war so far, I would say there are three stages that we can talk about. The first one is the shock and awe. If I would use that terrible slogan, shock and awe, against the Iraqi people and civilians in the city of Baghdad, and called the shock and awe, I would say that was the shock and awe for Israel, the October 7. It was not the 9/11, of course, but it was the shock and awe for them. And at that time, there was some kind of an admiration, not because you are killing civilians or anything like that, but the admiration in the Arab world feeling that, wow, for the first time, we were told that nobody can conquer Israel, nobody can beat them, nobody can do anything. And people started to compare between two things. Between the Arab armies, whether in Israel, Jordan, and Syria, how they were conquered and withdraw from their lands in less than a week or 60 days in 1967? And how come this kind of guerrillas, small one, how come they are still, until now, not accepting, they are holding their ground, and they did not withdraw as expected? That was very tough for Arab governments when they saw that. But yet, some of the Arab governments were happy that someone would embarrass the Israelis. Maybe they will be a little bit linear in the discussion. The other thing is that what happened on October 7 also revived again the issue of a Palestinian issue. Until few weeks before, the statements from Crown Prince MBS Mohammed bin Salman was talking about easing the plight of Palestinians. We're not talking about right, but easing their life. That's totally changed now. Then the second phase of the shock and awe of October 7, which is the bombardment and the killing of civilians in Gaza. And here we have a different reaction to it in the Arab world. There are the Arab TV that is owned or run by Arab Gulf states that they are in normalization, like UAE, or about to normalize, like Saudi. And here, in this case, most of the criticism is against Hamas, and you would hear more criticism against the resistance than you would hear it against Israel. You would move to, and this camp I would call the camp of peace for peace. And they are away from the borders, from the fight, anything like that. The other camp of peace are land for peace. And you will find Jordanian and the Egyptians. And that camp of land for peace had tough time in how to handle it. They allowed some of their commentators to attack Hamas, as in the case of Egypt, but in the same time, they highlighted the fear of transfer, and that what matters for us is to protect Sinai, not to protect Gaza. So even the Egyptian president was very clear about that you can take them to Nakab, but not here. So the idea was at that time, I don't care what you do with them, although it's not said, but not for Sinai. The third or the last stage is what we are witnessing now, is that Al Jazeera coverage of the events, which Al Jazeera excels actually in war and crisis and all of that stuff, made it very difficult for the rest of them to look bad for most of these governments and their Arab media. And what happened that they joined them. Last night I was watching between Sky News of United Arab Emirates, Arabiya of Saudi, Al Jazeera, almost like 3 minutes there, here, and you would find almost the same line that you did not see that before. And part of that is that the resistance of the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, in one side, and also that their people cannot take it anymore, and they can no longer associate themselves with the Israeli position. I would like just to end with two things here. The social media, how the social media made a big difference. I used to tell my students in media, like, the difference in social media between in the US or in the West and social media value in the Arab world. But in the US, social media is needed for views, not news, because they have free media and they know the news. In the Arab world, we need it for both. No news, no views on the most of the controlled media, government-controlled media, so we go to social media in the Arab world. Unfortunately, in this crisis and this war, the social media in the US and in the West is serving what used to do also for the Arab world. People found that this media does not represent them. It is controlled, no regard of any professional standards, and they got to go for the news from the social media. The Israelis used the social media as well as the rest. And the last thing is that you would find that unfortunately we used to make jokes about Arab spokespeople, government spokespeople, military spokespeople, because of the experience of 1967 when the radio commentator was telling us that we are shooting down every 1 hour 10 or 20 Israeli jets, and we found out that they're already there on the borders or close to our cities, and all of that was nonsense. In this crisis, it's the opposite, which is really very strange, is that while Abu Ubaidah, the spokesperson for Qassam brigades or Hamas, is the one that is trusted and never someone questioned any information that he presented without even video to prove what they are talking about. And on the other side, the country that we have always bragged about them. I would tell people, if it's declassified, take it. Yeah, this guy was a spy. Yes, Israel said that. Golda Film said that. Now, unfortunately, it's totally not the case, because people found that even the media and the propaganda was something cheap and did not stand any test. Finally, the casualty, in my opinion, of the war is human rights issue, or the having the U.S. to be the leader promoting human rights and democracy in the Arab world. I think they succeeded and they made a big service for dictators and authoritarian regimes in the Arab world, because if you hear any commentator in Arab media, they will tell you, look, where is the human rights? Where is the human rights? In a way that don't tell us any more about human rights. They are not saying that because they are with you against what is going on against Palestinians, but they are using that for their own reason, that once this is over, America are not gonna tell us anything about human rights. We're gonna do whatever we want with them. And I consider this is the main casualty of human rights. Just before the end of the war, while it's going on in Egypt, the presidential candidate, Ahmad Tantawi, people expected that sometime later on after the election, he will be imprisoned. They immediately have been indicted with 21 members of his campaign for whatever fabricated charges. And I think these are the benefits for authoritarian regimes in the world of what Biden administration did. He failed people and unfortunately betrayed the cause of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now open for questions and answers, and I'd kind of like to start off with a question. You can actually go to the mic if you would like to ask your question. But I'd like to start off with a question. It seems to somehow have been lost in the mix here that on October the 6th, the day before, it was called Al-Aqsa Flood. There were 5,000 missiles launched from Hamas that absolutely breached Iron Dome. It failed. It failed miserably. And Netanyahu has always stood for, at his best, brutality for the sake of safety. And now the Israeli people know they're not safe. So my question to you as the press, why isn't more attention being paid on Netanyahu, his failure, the precariousness of his position, and how it is not real hard to recast this war, this effort, as a personal vendetta of Netanyahu to save himself? Because once we realized that Bolsonaro wasn't Brazil, once we realized that al-Qaddafi was not Libya, once we realized that Hitler was not Germany, we could destroy the evil that was being done by those individual people. So what is being done to shine the light on Netanyahu and his personal responsibility?
I mean, for me, real quickly, I think the kind of binary, the kind of binary approach that the U.S. media takes to this, with us or against us, you stand with Israel or you stand with the terrorists. doesn't open any space for nuance within that question. And so among Israeli readers of the Israeli press, it is assumed that those readers generally stand with Israel. And so that opens a space for them to be highly critical of Netanyahu as you know, the polls, what are the polls, 85% or so disapproval of Netanyahu. It's the gap between how Netanyahu is understood here and there is you could drive a truck through it. It's wild. But I think it has to do with our inability to move beyond a black and white view of it.
And I think that that's an
Shall I take a crack at it?
expansion of the old saying that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. So that's a trick Netanyahu is using. If you're against me, you're not a patriot anymore. Even though this is perhaps entirely personal, I guess, is the question.
Well, two things. One, first of all, in the Israeli press, in Hebrew, the conversation is, we will demand, you know, answers later on, but this is not the time. But when you see this, this is not like, you know, at the top of the page. This is like you have to scroll way, way, way down to see even that. That's number one. Number two, Netanyahu is Israel. There is no alternative. In 1973, after the October War, the Israeli people the Israeli voters had an option to vote for somebody else. There was an opposition. There is no opposition. It's Netanyahu, and everybody else is like playing musical chairs. So there's nobody to replace him, and politically, he is, you know, he is the master. He runs the show. So and of course, if this is the Israeli press, we're not going to see people outside of Israel criticizing him and demanding that sort of thing. And I doubt very much that this is going to affect him politically in any way.
So I think we'll take audience questions. Thank you guys for indulging my question. Is that on? Could someone help with the microphone? Is Ali here?
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. If you're anything like me, you're suffering from lack of sleep from all this. My question today is, I saw Sky News coverage on the march in London on Saturday focusing on 100 far-right protesters instead of the estimated 300,000 who attended. The Wall Street Journal featuring an op-ed featuring from Israeli leaders calling the world to take 10,000 Gaza refugees on moral high ground standards. Major news organizations just blatantly limiting coverage on this war because they can no longer defend it. The world is watching all this unfold on social media for the first time, so it's getting harder to present the one-way narrative. Now Macron threatening to suspend social media. I'm afraid that the longer this goes on, phones and cameras being used to show the atrocities in Gaza on social media will not happen. How does the international media report the facts and stop bending to the leadership in the West? I guess people need to start calling out these news organizations.
Real quickly, the most interesting shift I've seen in media coverage is related to social media and the way that the American public and also global kind of public more broadly has started identifying with what they understand to be kind of influencers or like content creators, because all of a sudden, like people in America are seeing people in Gaza and understanding their situation. Like these are people starting out, hey guys, I'm in my apartment, and then boom, you hear the shelling in the background. And I think it's possible something like that could have developed when Russia was invading Kyiv, because you had the civilians kind of under threat but it only lasted for a brief amount of time before the kind of Russians were driven back, and then it devolved into the kind of trench warfare that it's been for the last couple of years, and so that didn't really lend itself to kind of civilian coverage of it in the same way, coupled with the fact that there was virtually no, or perhaps no, kind of Western media inside Gaza. So that supercharged the phenomenon, and you have so many people who have gone from 2,000 followers on TikTok and Instagram to 1 million or so. We had Hind Cowdery, who's a Palestinian journalist, write a great piece for us just the other day. What I suggest people go check it out. She was part of that kind of very harrowing and mournful exodus over the weekend from Gaza City down south. But I think at this point she's at 700,000 or something Instagram followers. She was she wasn't even working full time on October 7th. The Turkish news outlet reached out to her a couple days afterwards, said, "Can you give us some coverage while you're there?" And so people now, when they don't hear from those folks for an hour or two, you can watch the comment sections just melt down with this existential fear that this person that they have developed this parasocial relationship with has been killed. And so Israel is killing all of these people that Western audiences have come to love and trust, and killing them in real time. And I think that has changed the entire way that people understand this conflict.
I mean, the Biden administration has to demand that Israel protects journalists. Journalists in Gaza are the way that we're getting the news. And we know an inordinate, an unacceptable number have already been killed. Their family members have been killed. They've been pushed out of Al-Shifa hospital, so they can't actually cover what's happening right now. And that means we all lose if journalists can't do their jobs and they can't do them safely. So this should not be controversial for everybody to say that journalists should be able to do their jobs safely and to not be targets. And we saw just last week that the Israeli government and military put some journalists literally on a kill list after a group called Honest Reporting falsely claimed that these journalists had prior knowledge of October 7th. The group then backtracked when the AP and the New York Times basically said that's not true and said, well, we're not a news organization, we're just posing questions. But groups like that need to be condemned, they need to be shut down, they need to be criticized for what they're doing, and journalists need to be able to do their jobs safely.
Thank you.
The panel portrayed very well how biased is some or most of U.S. media. But what are the perceived reasons behind some U.S. media outlets taking sides instead of objective, balanced reporting on the Gaza war?
Well, I think there might be several reasons, but the reason that I find most glaring is the fact that there is no Palestinian voice. There is no Palestinian voice. The Palestinian people and the Palestinian issue is an orphan. They're an orphan. There's no organization. There is no state. There's no, other countries like some, non-aligned used to be, or some other group that speaks for the Palestinian people and presents the Palestinian case. And unless there is, and because there is no Palestinian story being presented, the Israeli story, which is a very compelling one, even though it's based on lies, is the only one that's out there. So I think that is perhaps, if not the main reason, one of the main reasons that we see the press one-sided and we see politicians being so one-sided.
I think also it's racism, plain and simple. I think there's still a lot of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim discrimination, racism, frankly, and I think it's hard to watch the news media coverage over the last 40 days and not conclude that Palestinian lives are simply worth less. I mean, it's clear from the stories they choose to cover to the stories they choose to not cover, that and we can't disconnect that. I mean, we've seen that kind of racist hate rear its head in other international contexts and other settler colonial contexts. So I think it's impossible to not talk about racist hate when you talk about so many things involving this situation.
Good afternoon. All of you saw the March for Israel yesterday. I would not go into the diatribes which were mentioned there. But we all know AIPAC is a foreign agent. But what is most, it's not surprising that it was heavily funded by Jewish sororities and fraternities, Hillel. I have the brochure which paid them $250 per student to come in for the March for Israel. there's no doubt about that. They should also be considered as foreign agents and lobbies. And they are creating a generation of mercenary Zionists for generations to come. And this should be highlighted, and there was no press coverage, there was no mention, and everybody, all the news anchors were there, and this is pathetic, this is symbolic of what is the mainstream media in the US is doing, and it's shameful. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much. No, it was a comment, not a question.
Oh, okay. So do you have a question?
I just wanted to make an observation.
Oh, thank you. Are there any other questions?
How's it going? I think I've seen over the past few years, especially in the younger generation, Gen Z, early or later millennials, there's a big kind of growing audience among independent media outlets, alternative media on platforms like YouTube, and independent journalists on Substack. There's a growing number, and I think a lot of people are gravitating towards that because of the agency that a lot of these, and the more kind of creative freedom a lot of these journalists may have on those outlets as opposed to legacy media. And I know, Ryan, you've done some work in alternative media with like counterpoints, things like that. And so this question is kind of geared towards you, but open to hearing from anyone. I'm wondering what you think a lot of these independent outlets, what their role is in times like this, where they kind of have a little more agency and they can speak to a growing number of young people, and what you feel also the future of that media looks like with the growing influence that's going on.
Yeah, certainly, and The Intercept too. It has tremendous independence as well. And so my day job is there, and then I also, as you know, do this show Wednesday morning, Counterpoints, which is independent and allows us to, have the room to say, call it exactly how as we see it. I think we're at a place where something like a majority of news is coming from those types of sources now. It's quite disaggregated and disorganized. The problem that it has not solved yet is news gathering. Al Jazeera, for instance, has people all over the world, and is getting and has institutional connections with people all over the world, so that they can verify information, get direct comments, have people on the ground. Whereas a lot of these independent content creators, a lot of them will call themselves, a lot of these independent journalists, are relying on the mainstream press to kind of create the foundational news, which they then use their own kind of background to put a different kind of spin on, which is important because that is extremely helpful. You can take the same set of facts and you can tell an accurate story, or you can take a set of facts and spin it into a lie. But if the independent news media can continue to grow and then start to kind of build out its capacity for news gathering, I think that would help. The algorithms push everything away from that, though. They push everything towards individuals. Like once you start trying to build teams and organizations, algorithms start to punish that. And I think that that's deliberate in the sense that that would then allow those people to kind of organize more effectively for a larger revenue share against, say, YouTube or Spotify or whatever the platform is. So that's tough, but it'll require. But the growth is unmistakable, and hopefully it can punch through. Do you have any thoughts on, or anybody else have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think part of the issue is that, like, the media industry is once again imploding. So, Vice, which did really excellent on the ground reporting from all over the world, including Palestine, doing some reporting that really few others have, filed for bankruptcy, and it looks like it's going to shut down. Same with other outlets that were a bit more interested in taking risks in their reporting. So I think until we can figure out a business model that's actually viable for small outlets and large alike, you're going to see a proliferation of sort of new outlets that target like elite billionaires that are not necessarily going to do the kind of news gathering that Ryan is talking about that's so important to offer actually real on-the-ground reporting of what's happening. But I would just plug, Al Jazeera. There's still an English channel. It's on YouTube. It's free to stream for those who don't speak Arabic. But it's really important, and it's done work that, frankly, no other or very few other news organizations have done from Gaza. So it's important to support the outlets that are doing that work as well.
One thing also about social media and the alternative, because one way of promoting alternatives and small outlets usually use social media, Facebook, Twitter, to promote about it, or even using the YouTube. And here we go back to the issue of who holds or who controls the media and the establishment of mainstream media. Same people who are behind the holding the established media and mainstream media or traditional media now are the owners and the administrators of the new social media. You can see that in Facebook in particular. Had it not been for Musk to get Twitter now, we would have been facing in the Arab world the same restrictions that you would find in Facebook. There is no way you get maybe more than 100 or 200 people seeing your post in Facebook if it has the words Israel or Gaza or things like that. Some of the hashtags are not allowed. If you enter in hashtag Tufan al-Aqsa, the flood or the storm of Aqsa Mosque, as a hashtag that started from October 7, the Facebook will tell you this is contradicting to the community standards. And nobody is explaining to you what is wrong with the community standards of Facebook. So the other problem is that without social media, you're not going to develop alternative small outlets or independent outlets.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me, before you start, could you introduce yourself, please? Not for any other purpose.
Sure, no problem.
There's a large column that appears to be speaking, and so if you could introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. My name is Joey Musmar, and I want to thank the National Interest Foundation for hosting this event and for all of you all to show up and present to us. Miko Peled talked about how Netanyahu seems to be pretty secure as the only guy who's going to be running Israel. I want to flip it and ask about our dear President Biden, and what do you think his prospects are for 2024? And what you think the Arabic community in certain states like Michigan and Georgia, what role they may have to play in determining that future? Thank you.
I mean, his prospects are not great. The thing that makes his prospects what they are is Trump. That Trump has basically lost every election that he's been on the ballot for. 2016, he lost even to Hillary Clinton, one of maybe the least popular kind of major party candidate in decades. She beat him by 3 million votes. He squeaked by in the Electoral College. 2018 was a Democratic wave. 2020, he lost by even more to Joe Biden, and he lost to Hillary Clinton. 2022, which became something of a referendum on him, was a good year for Democrats. And so there is an anti-Trump coalition out there that is huge. Whether it can come together around Biden for a second term is very much an open question. I think any other Democrat probably is a 70-80% chance of beating Trump. He's probably down somewhere around 50. But I think you're right that Michigan in particular could see. I think that's the state where you're most likely to see some real damage being done to him. A major donor of his I was talking to this morning, and he said, genocide is where I get off the bus. It's really kind of penetrating at the highest levels and at the grassroots levels. So we'll see. It's a year from now. Which is a lot of time. It may be a year from now that we have an even, or the public has an even starker understanding of what's happening right now. Because we're probably at, if you look at I think the polling I saw today had about 30+%, roughly 30% of the American people supporting what Israel's doing right now. That's got to be, it's not going to get higher than that. I can't imagine how it gets higher than that as people learn more about what's going on.
And I think the Reuters report said a couple of weeks ago it was 42. Yeah. There's a report being circulated to that point that recent polls in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, some serious border states, that the support for the Biden administration among voters 18 to 32 has dropped to below 30% because of the precipitous leap into the arms of Israel to the exclusion of a reasoned approach. And so college student, younger voters are doing that. Now, interestingly enough, the Democratic Party has taken great comfort in the younger voters, handing them victories in places like Virginia. I think what they fail to see is that means the younger voters are going to vote. So if they're against you, they're not going to stay home. If they're for you, they're not going to stay home. So I think that's a good question, but I think it does tie into what we're talking about today. And you may see a shift in the press if you see a shift in the official doctrinal dogma, because this administration, unlike many others, as my colleague Bruce Fein and I discussed, I can't think of an administration that was more geared solely toward campaigning and nothing for policy, nothing for the people, everything for campaigns and for votes. So we may see a doctrinal shift as policy that will come through the media shift. I don't know.
My name is Khaled Tarani. Actually, I was going to answer his question because I have a comment. I don't have a question. I came from Michigan for this conference, so thank you for the National Interest Foundation. Last Wednesday, we held a press conference titled Abandoned Biden. And we are launching actually in the 7 swing states from Michigan to Georgia, from Wisconsin to Pennsylvania, young voters for justice in Palestine. And our sole aim is one aim, and that is to make Joe Biden a one-term president. We've got to punish Joe Biden. We call him in Michigan Genocide Joe. Thank you. And our slogan is Genocide Joe have got to go, seriously. And we're working it in a very methodical kind of way, and that is what we're going to do. That's what we're committed to. We're reaching to the young voters mainly, but to the rest of the voter body in the state of Michigan, as well as in coalition with the other swing states. One of the things that we'll do, just so that we're not taking ourselves out of the electoral politics, is that we're going to vote the bottom of the ticket. The top of the ticket is going to be left blank, and just to make sure that the message is going to go out to Joe Biden. By the way, our polling have shown that the drop in voters for Joe Biden has dropped from among Muslim voters mainly in the state of Michigan from 80% to 5.2%. So we will punish Joe Biden, we'll make him interim president.
Can I ask you something? I'm sorry, I wanna ask you something. So clearly, if the Democratic Party wanted to win the White House, they would replace Joe Biden, but that doesn't seem to be the case. But there is a candidate. I mean, Jill Stein is fantastic on Palestine. Why not vote for her since she's in the game?
Yeah, thank you very much. For the 29th of November, which is the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, a UN event that is marked worldwide, we're inviting Jill Stein and Cornel West to come to Michigan just for that purpose. But we want to make sure that the message will go clear to Joe Biden that you're being punished because your hands have the blood of 5,000 Palestinian children, and make sure that the message is there. We do not want this to be what happened in 2000 when we punished Al Gore for not standing against the use of secret evidence, and Laila there probably was part of the family that handed George Bush the presidency, so it is on your hands. But really, the message did not get there, that you're being punished because you stood against our community in 2000. And literally, it was that only factor, that the use of secret evidence. This time, we'll make sure that we're going to do it. We'll announce it. We'll see how we're going to do it. And then we'll do it. We're going to throw it in their face, that you stand against our community and you stand for war crimes. Supporting war crimes is just, there are going to be consequences for sure.
Thank you. And I would point out there's an attorney in this room. Well, there's two attorneys that represented Jill Stein and the Green Party in an effort to get them on the ballot, and somehow it didn't work out, even though it was a clear antitrust violation. It's Bruce Fein and myself. But I think we have time for one more question. So once again, identify yourself so it does not appear like an anonymous giant column is talking. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Mohammed Al-Mutairi, and thank you to the National Interest Foundation for inviting me to this event. My question is to the panel and to Mr. Miko about we're seeing statements from the Israeli cabinet, such as to use nuclear weapons on Gaza. We're seeing a lack of coverage for these types of statements or for other apartheid statements or racist statements that are aimed towards the Palestinian people, which have been dealing with apartheid, war crimes, racism, marginalization, and all of these are against international law, against the UN Charter. How come we are not seeing more coverage by Western media outlets, specifically American media outlets, CNN, Fox News? They don't give these types of statements, which are troubling, by a member of the Israeli cabinet and why don't we see accountability given for these types of bluntly racist statements?
Well, I think we addressed the panel addressed some of what you just asked previously. I think the one about the one minister who said that they shouldn't rule out nuclear weapons against Gaza, I think he needs to read a little bit more about the effects of nuclear weapons in the region, and where exactly he's going to hide is not clear. But again, putting
agriculture minister.
Yeah, I forget. Yeah, exactly. Yes. He was an expert in something. Yes. Look, I think we need to put this in perspective. This is not the first time that we're hearing Israeli officials, we're hearing Zionist spokespeople speak in genocidal terms, in massively racist terms. This is going back maybe 100 years. The entire Zionist concept is a racist, supremacist concept. They've never hidden it. They've created an apartheid state 3 years after the end of the Holocaust. They were allowed to create an apartheid state and engage in a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing and genocide 3 years after the end of the Holocaust. And they've never hidden their intentions. They were never trying to be careful about their statements. So this is nothing new. Now, like I said earlier, in the absence of a robust response that is fighting for airtime, we're not going to see anybody criticize this. Israel has a well-oiled, I mean, not Israel just, but the entire Zionist operation has a well-oiled, well-funded, very experienced campaign, PR machine that's been engaged in this for over 100 years or more. And they are pushing very, very hard for airtime. And they're everywhere, as you know. I mean, they're in every city, in every state, pushing for new definitions of anti-Semitism and airtime on this and airtime on that. And there's nobody on the other side pushing for that. So, and Laila was right. I mean, the racism is obvious. I mean, this is all the accusations against the Palestinian fighters after October 7th were accepted because there's a very, very, very fertile ground here to hear and accept racist tropes against Arabs and Muslims, right? And there is nobody pushing in the other direction. And you've got to push hard. You've got to be organized. You've got to be well-funded. You've got to have a presence in order to compete with that. So on the one hand, you've got the racism, which sees this as perfectly normal. I mean, yes, an Arab mob coming out of Gaza, of course they're going to rape women and behead children. Never mind, they were not a mob, they were well-trained fighters, they're Muslims, and on and on and on. So there's no reason in the world to believe any of that unless you've got this racist fertile ground. But again, there's no pushback. And without serious pushback, we're never going to see any of this presented in any of the the corporate mainstream media, or even in the conversations people in the street. I can't tell you how many panels I've been on in interviews where the other panelists are repeating these racist tropes against Palestinians over and over again, even the ones that have been proven to be lies. So it takes a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of work for that to change.
Okay, I think we'll have one more question.
Yeah.
If you can make it kind of brief, because we're running into the next.
It will be so brief. I'm Samah Watad. I'm a journalist. I'm a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and as you can hear, it's as complicated as you can see. I'm monitoring Israeli media recently, and they continue to incite again journalists challenging the Israeli narrative, including Palestinians and foreign journalists in Israel, inside of Israel, and others in the West Bank and Jerusalem. And in this situation, what collective tools do journalists have to address these challenges? And as a young journalist, I will say, honestly, I am afraid for my life, for my family life, and I'm really concerned about what I am writing everywhere, even on social media, and even what I'm writing to my friends privately.
I mean, I would say, obviously, there's tremendous risk, as you mentioned, for Palestinians living in Israel now in terms of the repression, arrests, even social media monitoring. We've heard of some of these reports. Unfortunately, it has not been covered in the U.S. corporate mainstream media, or it's been undercovered. But I think at your disposal is actually trying to pitch other journalists who can write these stories without personally facing repercussion, because we understand the risks are high. That's all I can think of off the top of my head, but because these stories need to be told and they're not being told enough. But yeah, I don't know, Miko, if you have other.
Well, where are you from?
A small village called Jat al-Muthallath. It's near Tul Karim, but inside of Israel.
So I said this several times already today. I mean, the Palestinians are orphans. The Palestinian issue is an orphan. And there's nobody to protect you. There's nobody who ever talks about the need to guarantee the safety and security of Palestinians, period. Not to mention children, not to mention journalists, not to mention health workers and so on. So your work is valuable, but the risk you're taking is enormous. And I know, because I know people in 1948 Palestine that are afraid to leave their home, afraid to go to work. I mean, I'm talking about doctors and attorneys and people who work within the Israeli establishment and so on. So I don't know that there's an answer, and until again, I'll say it again, until the Palestinian issue has a parent, until Palestinians have somebody who cares, until somebody wakes up and says, yes, the safety and security of Palestinians must be our priority. And again, nothing's going to change, and the risk that you exist in and the constant terror in which you and your family live is not going to be lifted unless somebody wakes up one morning and decides to care, or unless we as voters, we as constituents, we as consumers of the press, and many of the people here who are providers of news decide to change things. It's a very tough uphill battle, and I don't know that there's a good answer at all.
I'm asking, as journalists, as a collective group, who really concerned about, and we've seen a lot of casualties like Shireen Abu Akleh and the family of Wael al-Dahdouh. What, as a journalist, as a group, we can do for this situation, especially when you hear this from journalists. Israeli journalists are inciting against other journalists. It's like, for me, it's like so amazing to hear that every day. Really, it's like on base days, and really it's like so, and no one stopped them, and no one talk about this. They are journalists such as us, like.
I think journalism is a business. In every business, they find an agenda that sells. So you're going to find biases. I think the only thing you can do, and if I can speak for you guys, is search for the truth. Expose the truth, find the truth, and know the truth when you see it. That's the hard part. And know that your truth might not be the actual truth, and be willing to change. Is that close?
Yeah, it's bad. It's bad. Like there was an open letter from journalists urging that the Palestinian journalists be protected, and all of us signed it. But like you said, the rollback of civil society, even from pre-October 7th levels in Israel, is frightening. And we've covered it on our program, but it hasn't gotten much coverage in the mainstream press. People getting, the numbers of people getting arrested and fired for just, anodyne social media commentary is in the high thousands. It's not like, we're not talking about, we've all seen some high-profile instances of crazy, like, what, the teacher got arrested for saying that, but there's thousands of those. And so there is, like he said, there's no good answer right now.
Yeah, unfortunately, also as you mentioned, Bruce, that the nature of the beast. I mean, you're doing journalism in the Middle East and not just in the Arab world. I mean, the only problem is that the lie of saying the democracy and the rule of law in Israel or anything like that. Other than that, this is how Arab journalists are going through, whether their own governments or with the Israeli governments. And I always discourage some of my students who had double major in that, go with the other major. Please don't stay here unless you have a cause. If you can't take it, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. And it's very sad to say that, but the profession of being a journalist in this part of the world, and this part of the world, there is lack of democracy, I would say, and maybe end by saying because of Israel also. If you see the public opinion against what's going on and the way the Arab governments are putting the lid on it and trying to control that and prevent other people to express their views about what's going on, can explain to you why democracy is something very dangerous for the US administrations, whether Republican or Democrats, or for Israeli governments. And for that reason, they will never accept freedom of information or free press or even democracy in this part of the world because of the Israeli or Arab-Israeli conflict. Thank you.
Any more questions? Well, I would like to personally thank, one of the things I would like for people in this room to consider is we have to create change, and like every other scenario, change comes from the top to the bottom. We have to create a youth culture of political leadership, of political thought. We have to create a face for Palestine. That's not a face of suffering, that's not a face of anger, that's not a face of terror. That's a face of a leader and leadership. We have to start with young people. We need to think about financing and funding, development for people to create a Palestinian leader. We have Hafez Saffuri here. He's a 15-year-old. He's an extraordinary, bright, wonderful young man. We need to see more guys like that and ladies like that in meetings like this to create the future of Palestine. As I said earlier, and I meant it when I said it, it's a sovereign nation without a state. If it's going to realize its destiny, it needs people to take it there. And it can't be the same old people, and it can't keep doing the same thing. So anything we can do to help that. But I would like to personally thank Miko, Hafez, Ryan, and Laila for appearing on this panel. And there were some serious bets against my ability to survive this. I would say that I got the short straw, but my job was to not freeze in the shadow of the greatness of these people, and I think I might have done that, but these are truly great people here, and we're honored, again.
Thank you, Bruce. I'd like to thank our panelists. And also I'd like to recognize our staff and interns that helped put this together. Collins, Jacob, Ali, Brenna, and Loretta, thank you. Please give me a hand.